Boker Tov Havarim. So good morning. It's great to be back here in Northern Ireland. Please do pray for my throat because I didn't think I'd be even able to talk today. So it's an absolute pleasure to be amongst you. It's a pleasure to be here back in Northern Ireland, the one remaining last bastion of our Judeo-Christian heritage. So keep fighting for it. You haven't lost it yet. England may have done, Wales may have done, Scotland may have done, but Northern Ireland certainly hasn't. And it's great to see so many supporters of Israel and the Jewish people here today. Well, what can I say? 5 years ago, almost 5 years ago, I was here last, back in September of 2019. And how many of you could have imagined what we went through over the past 5 years? From a global pandemic in 2020, to a disastrous US military withdrawal from Afghanistan in August of 2021, to a Russian invasion of the Ukraine, and then, of course, last October, the worst mass terrorist attack in Israel's history on October the 7th. And, of course, what happened yesterday with the general election, unbelievable results. It feels as if evil is triumphing right now, whether that's in Israel or whether that's across Europe or in Great Britain. We are seeing a rise of evil, which makes me want to read Psalm 121, because I think this is very apparent. God is the help of those who seek him. I will lift up my eyes to the hills. From whence comes my help? My help comes from the Lord, who made heaven and earth. God is sovereign. He will not allow your foot to be moved, and he who keeps you will not slumber. Behold, he who keeps Israel shall neither slumber nor sleep. The Lord is your keeper. The Lord is your shade at your right hand. The sun shall not strike you by day, nor the moon by night. The Lord shall preserve you from all evil. Amen. He shall preserve your soul. The Lord shall preserve your going out and your coming in from this time forth and even forevermore. We, all of us, as born-again believers in Yeshua HaMashiach, we're in the battle of our lives. We are in the battle for our country's destiny, whether that's Northern Ireland or Great Britain. And certainly Israel is facing the biggest battle and spiritual battle in her history. And I want to give a perspective, a personal perspective of October the 7th. Now, I want to put this in context. Back in December of 2022, I had the privilege of attending the Christian Media Summit, and this is for broadcasters and Christian journalists all over the world, invited to Israel on behalf of the Israeli Foreign Ministry, the Government Press Office, and also the Prime Minister's Office. And it's been running since about 2017, and it stopped during COVID from 2020 and 2021, and then was re-established in 2022 in December. As a huge England fan, I was a little bit concerned that if England beat France in the quarterfinals of the World Cup, I'd miss a potential semi-final against Morocco. It never materialised. England lost 2-1, so I didn't have to worry about that. Thinking, where can I see England play in a semi-final? Doesn't happen very often, and of course there's a big quarter-final game today against Sweden. So you can't pray into these games. I've learned that from a child, but it's important to me, being English. But going back to what happened in October the 7th, particularly in 2022, Israel came out of the pandemic as one of the world's leading nations in terms of innovation, in terms of research development, in terms of startup nation. And we're in Israel at that time. I got friends who live in Herzliya, Israeli friends, like family. They're very close to me. And you see all these magnificent new skyscrapers going up in Herzliya, going up in Tel Aviv. And if any of you have the privilege of going on the new train that from Ben Gurion Airport all the way up to Jerusalem, takes about 25 minutes. Before, if you took a train, it would probably take you about 3 hours. or you have to mix it with the cheroot, which is that little taxi minibus, and that can be a bit smelly and very tight as you get on there, or you take a taxi or a bus up to Jerusalem. This year, in 2022, we were listening to Israeli cabinet ministers that were there. We got addressed by many corporations. Israel in 2022 felt like she was a rich and powerful nation. We don't need the help of the international community. We don't really need Christian help because we are thriving economically and we are doing incredibly well in terms of innovation, startup nation. That Israel, from the years from kind of COVID all the way up to 22, was a very kind of rich and wealthy nation. There was a complacency about the country. Now, what was also interesting is that the Prime Minister of Israel, the current Prime Minister of Israel, he was in opposition then, Benjamin Netanyahu, was supposed to address our delegation. Twice he failed to do so as he won the election. He was trying to put his coalition government together. I've got to say that from 2022 to right up till October the 7th that was my hardest year in broadcasting in terms of standing up for Israel because of the current Israeli government. And I love Israel. I love the Jewish people. My program's dedicated to it, the Middle East Report, the telling of the truth of Israel's cause. But we had a very nationalistic, a very religious and extreme government in power, currently still in power. And it's those problems, I think, that led up to October the 7th. Now, I remember that we had a delegation in December 2022, and we visited the south of Israel to meet the leaders of the Eshkol Regional Council. And we saw kibbutz Nirim, which is a beautiful kibbutz about a mile away from Gaza, and you can see Gaza just from the outline of the kibbutz. And they were telling us that we were met by their representatives, and we all had coffee in a particular room. And this one woman shared the fact that living here is 90% of the time paradise. But she said when the rockets and missiles come over, this place is sheer hell. But you could see how peaceful the kibbutz was, which is the little Jewish settlements, the lovely kind of flowers that grow there, the peacefulness was there. And then later that evening we had a meal, and we sat down and had a meal with representatives from the Eshkol Regional Council that run the whole area of the Negev. And they were speaking and they were saying, we're so grateful that you're here. Thank you so much for showing solidarity. And I said, look, excuse me, can I have the mic? And I said, no, you're thanking us for being here. We need to thank you because you're on the front lines. Not only are you defending Israel from the evil that is Hamas in Gaza, you are also defending the West against this demonic evil ideology that is represented in Islamic extremism, which is Hamas. Roll on to October the 7th, and many of those in that kibbutz were murdered by Hamas, and the terror and the horror that took hold on October 7th was absolutely unbelievable. Having visited Israel, thanks to the International Christian Embassy, Jerusalem, UK, to leaders and a solidarity gathering in Israel, we had the privilege, and I mean a privilege, of going to visit Kibbutz Nir Oz, of seeing one of the car parks that held 1,200 cars that were destroyed by Hamas on October the 7th. And when you get the impression of what actually happened on that day, if you watch it from our mainstream media, whether that's BBC, whether that's ITV, whether that's Sky or even GB News, you don't have an idea of the sheer magnitude that happened. And I think this is a kind of JFK moment. This is, everyone knew, well, I'm not old enough, but for those that you are, will remember where you are when JFK was shot. And all of you will remember the horrors of 9/11, what happened on 9/11 when Islamic terrorists sponsored by the Iranians together with Al-Qaeda carried out the worst mass terrorist attack the world has ever known by attacking the World Trade Center and the Pentagon. And October the 7th was one of those days that will go down as a day of infamy. People know where they were when that happened. That particular day, had some news feeds coming in, and you saw some videos of somehow Hamas had infiltrated Israel's Eretz crossing. And I had to drop my wife off to have her hair done while I took my dog around Wimbledon Common, just kind of finding out what was actually happening. And I don't trust the mainstream media to give me news information what's happening on Israel. I don't trust the BBC. I don't trust Sky. I don't trust ITN. And so I thought there must be a way of looking at what's happening regarding the situation in Israel. So I tuned into I-24, which is Israel's news channel, which is very good, by the way. And when they started showing stories that Hamas had infiltrated 22 locations in Israel, I thought, this is serious. I mean, we're talking in the region here, it turned out to be correct, between 4,000 and 5,000 Hamas terrorists had breached Israel's security on October the 7th. And of course, we know about the massacres that took place. We know about the personal stories that took place. But I would just like to show you a report, a short report that I did, thanks to the International Christian Embassy, Jerusalem, in which we visited one of the car parks, one of 3 car parks. And these were mainly the cars that were destroyed on October the 7th. So it should be coming up now. So. Yeah, of course.
Hi, this is Simon Barrett of Revelation TV in the UK. What you can see behind me is one of the cars that was attacked on October the 7th, the worst mass terrorist attack in Israel's history, where Israel was confronted by approximately 2,000 to 3,000 Hamas terrorists on that day. You can see the carnage they've done with the cars behind me, with these Iranian-supplied grenades that ignite and inflame these cars and actually burn them to ashes. And for those people who really do question whether October the 7th happened, well, here's the crime scene. Here's the evidence of the mass murders that took place on October the 7th. And it's a reminder of the world to wake up, to realize this is terrorism. This is the worst kind of terrorism that we've seen in decades, certainly comparable to 9/11. And the magnitude of the destruction that occurred on October the 7th is nothing less than absolutely horrific and evil. And you can see with the evidence behind the total carnage caused by Hamas back on October the 7th. I want to take you back to October the 7th, and you can see behind me how this beautiful black Audi has been absolutely shot to bits by Hamas terrorists. And around us we see the absolute carnage caused by Hamas on October the 7th. This is real. This happened, and you can see car after car after car just parked up here with their windscreens shot to bits, tyres burnt out, It's a scene of absolute carnage and absolute terror. And to be one of those Israeli drivers on October the 7th, when Hamas carried out this terrorist attack, must have been absolutely horrific. And the world needs to know what happened on October the 7th. This is the equivalent of what happened in the Shoah or the Holocaust, to realize the true magnitude of the scale of this attack by Hamas back on October the 7th. As you can see, this was, until recently, a crime scene. This is the biggest crime scene I've ever seen. I'm sure the biggest crime scene that you've ever seen. But I want to show you this car, because this just brings to life how personal this is. Because in this car, looks like these were just in Israeli day trippers. They packed their bags for the beach. And then you can see in the back seat is a children's book. And then in the front, personal items with pens, which makes it very, very personal of what happened. That these people did not expect to see what they saw on October the 7th. And it just brings that personal element that these were people, real people, who in one moment their life was just taken. And it describes really what the Bible talks about, is suddenly people are saying peace and safety, and suddenly there is no safety. We can see this with here, this sudden terrorist attack on October the 7th by Hamas, and that these are real people who drove these cars on October the 7th. So what we can see in this car is that these poor people had absolute no chance of survival, going on a family day out to the beach to the south, and then to be confronted by Hamas terrorists on October the 7th is just beyond horrific. Words can't describe the magnitude of what we're seeing here, the total destruction by Hamas, killing innocent Israeli civilians in their car who had no self-defense, no way of getting out of those situations. And you wonder why Israel is launching a military operation into Gaza to destroy Hamas. Well, it's because of this.
Thank you. I think that just shows you, you won't see that on the mainstream media. You won't see that on the BBC or Sky News. But it was important to be an eyewitness to those horrific events. Now, it turns out that Hamas used a secret weapon on October the 7th. And this was a weapon that was like a kind of a flamethrower. And it was a handheld missile that they used, that had the capabilities of making cars or metal burn for about 12 or 13 hours. And of course we saw the carnage of the cars all piled up from there. And usually if you throw a grenade at a car or a vehicle, it will burn for 2 or 3 hours max. This burned for 12 or 13 hours. Hamas used that on the kibbutzes, and they used it on those cars, and most of those cars were from the Nova Music Festival. I mean, there were some very expensive vehicles there. You know, I think you saw a white Land Rover that was very expensive. There were some Porsches. So these were some very kind of rich young Israelis that attended the Nova Music Festival on October the 7th. And, you know, it's not until you see the devastation for yourselves, you realize really what happened and how everything has changed in Israel now since October the 7th. That Israel was on the verge of civil war prior to October the 7th because of the judicial reform. And it wasn't the fact that the Israeli government was announcing how they wanted to stop the influence of the judiciary over the Prime Minister's office, to give the Israeli Prime Minister more power and to bring about what he wanted to bring about. In Israel, it's all about perception. If the religious are opposing to demand that there is a reform of the judiciary, this will favor the religious, therefore They will enforce Shabbat and close every shop and businesses on Shabbat. We won't be able to travel. This will infringe upon our civil liberties, say those of the left and the secular Israelis, while those on the right want to impose a kind of more of a Judeo-theocracy upon the nation. And that was the reason why there was such protests, such anger, such resentment in Israel. But after October the 7th, everything changed from there. We also visited kibbutz Nir Oz, one of the kibbutzes that was completely devastated by Hamas. And one of the reasons I wanted to go out there, and I'm sure that many of you have come across this, is that dealing with 7-day deniers. So we know of Holocaust survivors. Now we're seeing that so many, even Christians, are getting caught up with this October the 7th denial. Now, I did a talk prior to that in about December at my wife's mother's church up in Anglesey in North Wales. I was asked to preach, and after I spoke at the church, a guy came up to me and completely rubbished everything I said and said, "Don't you know that what happened on October the 7th was a false flag operation?" Essentially, this was the Israeli military that carried out the attacks on the south of Israel on October the 7th as a pretext for the invasion of Gaza. So what we're dealing with is a real battle for truth. And just as British generals who liberated Bergen-Belsen, the Holocaust concentration camp, and recorded what they saw for prosperity, they did that in order to warn future generations who didn't believe the Holocaust actually happened, that it happened. And having visited kibbutz Nir Oz, all I can say was that was like a pogrom, or it was like you are part of you actually felt that this was another Holocaust that happened. And I've got some pictures now, if we can show that, and another report from kibbutz Nir Oz. So this one is not such good quality as it's recorded on my phone, but hopefully we can get that up in a minute, because it's important to understand what happened, because by understanding what happened on October the 7th, we can identify more now with Israelis and with Jewish people, because we're living in an unprecedented rise of Jew hatred once again. So got a lot of pictures here. That all green area in January was the actual site of the Nova Music Festival. So this is where the atrocity against the Israeli partygoers at Nova took place. That's the field, that's where all the horrific events of October happened. And hopefully we can see a few more in a minute. I can talk you through them, which there looks very peaceful, looks very pleasant, and you can't imagine what happened. So on October the 7th, it was around 1,200 Israelis were brutally murdered by Hamas. A region of 6,000 to 7,000 were injured, many of those critical, and over 250 Israeli nationals were then taken to Gaza as hostages. So if we show a few more, maybe of kibbutz Nir Oz, and you see the devastation done to those kibbutzes there. See, this is one of the rockets that Hamas used on October the 7th. You can see it's burnt absolutely everything, and the only thing left standing on that picture was an air conditioning unit. Everything else is completely burnt down. If we can go to a few more. So there we go, that's Gaza. It shows you how I zoomed in on my phone, because Gaza was about a mile away. And you could see then the devastation caused by Israeli military forces in Gaza, knowing how close it is to kibbutz Nir Oz. And also what's interesting there is we heard gunfire going off, we heard Israeli artillery going off, but when you're there, you never have a sense of danger, you never have a sense that that this is a dangerous situation. So this is the first house, or what kibbutz house, that was completely destroyed by Hamas on October the 7th. There you go, a bit more of a devastation caused there as well. Everything was kind of burnt to the ground. And what surprised me as well, look, there's some of the houses that were destroyed as well. What surprised you the most as well is you see like TV screens that had been taken off the wall, scattered on the ground, as many Arabs would have fled Gaza and come in. And there you can see inside the actual houses themselves that were destroyed by Hamas. Just absolute total devastation and destruction. And I've got a little bit of a report there if we can go to that. You're doing a good job, technical guy. Thank you very much. Yeah, thank you. That gives you an idea of what actually happened. We're here at Kibbutz Nioz, and if you can look through into this house of this kibbutz, the complete devastation caused by Hamas on October the 7th, and you could just imagine the Israeli family living here, completely unaware of the horrors that were going to take place only a few moments before Hamas launched the most devastating terrorist attack in Israel's history back on October the 7th. Okay, so you can see around there like the sea and the box, and that was kind of reference to the fact that this was a crime scene, and the severity of the crimes committed by Hamas were then marked by the Israeli investigators. What you also see, which is really horrific, is pictures of the Israeli hostages that were taken back to Gaza. And also there, what you see as well is that you can't really comprehend what you're seeing. That's the hard thing to actually process when you're actually there. And it kind of hits you 6 weeks later emotionally to see what Israel went through. And literally Israel has never been through anything like this, that more Jewish people we haven't seen the largest number of Jewish people murdered on October the 7th since the Second World War in the Holocaust, which shows you the magnitude of this. As part of the ICJ UK Leaders Conference in Jerusalem back in January, we had a pastor from Ashkelon who shared a very powerful story of what happened on October the 7th, because it literally took the IDF 6 hours to get onto the scene, and it took them 3 days to wipe up all the Hamas terrorists who were in Israeli territories that were committing murder. They were committing mass rapes, they were committing torture, burning babies, and I've seen babies burnt, and I've seen pictures of babies burnt, and it's just beyond the pale. The whole world should be mobilized in supporting Israel against their war against what is essentially a genocidal terrorist organization that has committed a genuine massacre, genuine war crimes, and yet Israel has been accused of committing war crimes when there has been no war crimes committed in Gaza. One thing that strikes you as well is that despite the fact that Israel's at war, there is a togetherness in Israel. There's a solidarity in Israel. There's a resolve. There's almost like there's a spiritual awakening in the hearts of the Jewish people to remind them of who they are, that they are God's chosen people. This is God's chosen land, and the Lord allowed it. Now, the pastor that we met from Ashkelon actually said that if it wasn't for the Nova Music Festival, and if it wasn't for so many Israeli partygoers at Nova that actually distracted Hamas on October the 7th, there was nothing stopping Hamas from moving all the way up to Ashkelon, which was one of Israel's southern cities, and committing absolute carnage in Ashkelon. So by the grace of God, we saw God's grace actually work and intervene there. It was a privilege to meet some of the Israeli soldiers that had been called up to fight in Gaza with incredible resolve after the horrors that took place. And when you reflect on what happened and you see what's happened for yourself, and you meet people that in the hotels that were staying in Jerusalem, because 1,800 Israelis have had to be evacuated from their homes in the south and their homes in the north, saying that they can't go back. They tell stories of how one woman told me that her son was murdered by Hamas on October the 7th. The whole nation of Israel is going through post-traumatic stress disorder. The nation is in shock. It's reeling of what happened. And, the world, sadly now, is turning against Israel because the narrative has shifted. It's all about Israel's war against Hamas in Gaza. Now, most commentators, most reports you read, kind of ignore what happened on October the 7th and just think that the Israelis have sent in the IDF into Gaza because they wanted to, because they take pleasure in killing innocent Palestinians. Well, nothing could be further than the truth. It was those communities in the south of Israel, like Kibbutz Nir Oz that I went to, like Kibbutz Narim that I know, that wanted to reach out to the residents of Gaza. They were going to establish a factory on the border between Israel and Gaza, that Israel had allowed between 13 and 17,000 residents of Gaza to work in Israel, to work on the kibbutzes, to work on the agriculture, on the fields. But what they did on that day, and what they did prior to October the 7th, was an incredibly impressive intelligence job. So they were reporting back to Hamas how many people were living in each kibbutzes, where the military reservists lives, where the security were based on those kibbutzes. And so therefore they knew everyone, and the local Israelis befriended these Palestinian Arab workers from Gaza, letting them sit in their homes, have conversation, because they wanted to build a friendship and peace and thought they could do that with cooperation. But what happened on October the 7th was literally, it was like the gates of hell were unleashed against Israel and against the world. And what we've seen now is the world is a different place now. We are seeing this rise of Jew hatred that we haven't seen since the 1930s and 40s. Jewish people now are scared to be Jewish. We are constantly seeing in our newspapers Jewish memorials are being attacked and vandalized with graffiti. Jewish people are facing death threats just because they're Jewish. We even have the British Medical Association targeting Jewish people because they're Jewish. Now, the big difference prior to October the 7th was pretty much that it was only Israel that was being attacked. Now we're seeing this fundamental attack on the Jewish people now. Now, the Jewish people are society's canaries in the mine. And I met back in 1999 an amazing guy who's been an incredible mentor and friend to me. And this is the Lord opened a door for me to go to Washington, D.C. And I met this amazing guy called Dr. Harold Rhodes, who's an Orthodox Jew, who served very high up in the Pentagon as an advisor to the Secretary of Defense on Islam and on Iran. And I remember him telling me that he said, look, the Jewish people are like the canary in the cage, that when the miners go deep into the mines, and if there were poison gases, the canary would die first. That would be a warning for the miners to get out. Well, today the Jewish people are God's reminder to the world of the dangers of what happened, what will happen if Jew hatred is not dealt with. Now, it's interesting when we see the rise of Jew hatred and how the Lord is using this also for his purposes, is because he's using this to bring the Jewish people home. Now, don't get me wrong, I hate Jew hatred with an absolute passion. And I will defend the Jewish people, and I will defend the nation of Israel with my life, and I do that on the Middle East Report. But I also recognize that the Lord has used Jew hatred in order to preserve God's people throughout generation after generation after generation. That it's been Jew hatred that has prevented the Jewish people from being assimilated into the nations and has kept them separate because they are a separate people. We also know that this ideology of Jew hatred is satanic, and it's literally comes from the pit of hell against God's chosen people. And that's the privilege, and this is why I'm so impressed with Brian, and my friendship with Brian is important because he understands that as Christians we need to build relationships and friendships with Jewish people so that they don't feel that they're alone. And at this time, probably since the Holocaust, the Jewish people feel very much alone. They are scared. Their anxiety is incredibly high. Many of them are thinking, well, where do we go now? But for Israel, what happened on October the 7th, the unthinkable happened. No Israeli cabinet minister, no one in Israel would have thought that Hamas could have breached Eretz Crossing on that day. I think in the back of the minds of the Israelis, they thought this was possible, but it's so dark, you don't want to even think about it. And I visited my Israeli friends in Herzliya, and my friend Tal has 3 beautiful sons, and they absolutely love football. So when I go over there, bought them some England shirts for the World Cup. So they love football, they're passionate about it, and wanted to play football with me in their big flat as well. And Tal, my friend, was telling me that her son, Kafir, who's only 9, has been having nightmares, and said, well, Mummy, will Hamas come after me? So I think when we see the impact that this has had on Israeli children, the impact that this is having on Israel is huge. Also the fact that Israel's had to call up its reservists. So now Israel has called up, I think after 360,000 reservists who are standing by, fighting for their lives against Hamas in Gaza. And Israel has to do this because this is an existential threat. That in the Middle East, it's all about the strongest will survive. If you are seen as weak, you've had it. And what was really interesting, I think, and many people haven't really noticed this, but a couple of weeks, about 2-3 weeks before October the 7th, the very small country of Armenia, which is a Christian country, which is the first Christian country to be established. It's in the Caucasus, and they have this ancient province called Nagorno-Karabakh, with their ancient churches, was attacked by Azerbaijan. And the ancient Christian community fell at the hands of Azerbaijan, backed up by Turkish forces. That was also a pretext for Hamas, the green light to say, yes, let's carry out the atrocities of October the 7th. I mean, once you now see the video footages, you see the IDF revealing the extent of the terror tunnels, horrific. I mean, from the Rafah crossing from Egypt into Jordan, there are literally tunnels the size of motorways. And October the 7th wouldn't have happened had it also not been for Egyptian involvement. Now, Israel has a peace treaty with Egypt dating back to 1979, known as the Camp David Accords. And Israel thought under General Sisi that they had a good relationship. Now, whether those Egyptian soldiers were bribed or not, all the weapons and all the terrorist attack that took place on October the 7th came smuggled through Egypt, through the Rafah crossing, into Hamas itself. Now, many, obviously, the Biden administration was fearful of an Israeli launch on the last bastions of Hamas in Gaza, because it reveals the extent of the Egyptian involvement, and probably the Americans had intelligence that this was happening but didn't pass this on to the Israelis. And considering that the Americans are supposed to be Israel's closest allies in the Middle East, that's a shocking betrayal of the one and only true democracy in the region. Now, where does this come from? This comes from the Iranian regime. I believe also gave a green light to October the 7th because they are so close to developing nuclear weapons. And this afternoon, I'll give an update on the geostrategic situation facing Israel. So I'm not going to go into that much now, but the Iranians were very much behind this. It was believed that Hezbollah should have launched a similar attack as Hamas did on October the 7th, but for some reason, they got cold feet. And had Hezbollah attacked Israel on October the 7th, we're talking about tens of thousands of deaths. We're talking about thousands of hostages, and we're talking about a more dangerous situation than Israel's faced. Now, I don't know how many of you know the IDF doctrine, that when the State of Israel was formed under the Prime Minister David Ben-Gurion, and the IDF was made up before of the Haganah, and then also the right-wing Stern and Ingram gangs led by Menachem Begin. And prior to Israel's War of Independence, those armies formed to form the IDF, the Israel Defense Force. Now, the strategy of the IDF has always been historically that Israel is too small a nation to absorb a military attack on her soil. So therefore, for the safety of the Israeli population, wars against Israel have to be fought on the enemy's territory. And that's exactly what Israel's done. But on October the 7th, this was the biggest invasion in Israel's history. And this took the IDF by complete surprise and complacency. And Israel's only just beginning to wake up now to the horrors that took place. But also the fact that this was well planned, this was well organized. It seemed like the mobile phone signal went down on October the 7th, that there was a cyber attack on Israel's security. And for some reason, Israel had a very skeleton IDF reservist based in the Eretz Crossing, which made it easy for Hamas to breach the Eretz Crossing and commit the atrocities that Hamas did. Now, since then, we see that Israel is not only fighting for a life in Gaza against a genocidal terrorist organization that, if was able to, would literally commit another Holocaust, as we saw on October the 7th, but also that Israel is fighting a diplomatic war in the UN. Israel is fighting a media war, which I'm very much involved in defending Israel in that media war. Israel is facing a social media war. Israel is also facing a legal war with lawfare being used against Israel, with the International Criminal Court wanting to have a moral equivalency between the Israeli Prime Minister and Israel's Defense Minister with the leaders of Hamas, and take them to the International Criminal Court in The Hague for alleged war crimes. You can't write this script. We've also seen, for example, on the streets of our major cities now in early October, I think a week after October the 7th, I was one of the speakers in London for the International Christian Embassy Jerusalem UK's London conference. Now, what concerned me a little bit at the time is that there was no security, and I'm thinking, like, we are literally going into a church and there is a mass gathering of Palestinian protesters protesting against Israel around the corner. Now, I left a bit early that day. I left at 2, conference finished at 4, and I walked into the midst of these people. As a student of history, I always felt, what would it be like to be in Germany in the early 1930s at a Nazi rally in Munich? I had a taste for it back then. You heard the chants of genocide on the mega mics. You saw the hatred in people's hearts, waving the Palestinian flags. What was also very interesting is that these were predominantly Muslim that turned up, mainly from the Middle East, but also from Pakistan and South Asia. And it felt like you were coming face to face with evil. Now I'm going to conclude that with Jew hatred, we saw that it was Jew hatred that led Theodor Herzl and the whole Dreyfus affair that happened in the 1890s in France to write the book Der Judenstaat. And Theodor Herzl, as a journalist from Austria, felt the only solution for the Jewish people against anti-Semitism was for Israel to have its own state. This is where we saw the birth of political Zionism, and Zionism literally means the right of the Jewish people to return to their ancient covenant homeland in fulfillment of biblical prophecy. And it was Jew hatred that led to the establishment of political Zionism, which was the main political force that led to the re-establishment of the modern state of Israel on the 14th of May 1948 in fulfillment of biblical prophecy. What followed then, as well as we saw in the 1930s, was a huge rise of Jew hatred across Europe with the rise of Nazism and fascism across Europe, which led to the Second World War. And I fear now that with the rise of Jew hatred today, after October the 7th, we might be heading for World War III. Because what starts with the Jewish people never finishes with the Jewish people. And when a society and nations don't stand up against this hatred, it's all consuming. Israel fills that gap. And today we see that the Labour Party has been elected. I don't know what promises they made to the Muslim community, but the Islamic community as on the whole is unified and rallying behind the Palestinian cause. They want this new government to recognize a Palestinian state that will lead not only to more terrorism against Israel, but will more likely lead to the destruction of Jordan, because Jordan would be locked in with a Palestinian state. Mahmoud Abbas, I don't think, would last a year or so if he becomes president of this new state before it's overthrown by Hamas, or if there's democratic elections, Hamas will win. So Israel then has to deal with, on the high plains of Israel, and I read that where does our help come from? The hills of Judea and Samaria, which is the biblical heartland of Israel, are Israel's natural security. Now Hamas would be able to fire rockets and missiles at the Israeli airports all over Israel and paralyze Israel. And then they would be locked in with Jordan, which is 70% Palestinian. So you could see the downfall of the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan being taken over by the Iranians. So the strategic implications are incredibly grave. Now, as Christians, we are in the spiritual battle of our lives because darkness is rising, evil is rising, but he that is in us is greater than he that's in the world. We have to stand up for Israel in this time. We can't afford to be quiet. We can't afford to be silent. We need to be Bonhoeffers in this generation. We need to speak the truth. We are living in the last days, and we can see that by the events that are occurring, which is turbulent, it's difficult. All of us are probably fighting battles within our own families and don't have that much energy to really defend Israel. But when we know that Israel is the apple of God's eye, when we know that God will be looking at each one of us to say, what did you do during this time? The church in the 1930s failed the Jewish people. Let us not be the church that fails the Jewish people today. And you can do that by supporting the International Christian Embassy Jerusalem, by blessing the Jewish people with practical love and support, but also by getting yourself informed and educated. You can do that as well by watching the programs that I produce, the Middle East Report and, of course, Jerusalem Dispatch, which highlights the ministry of the International Christian Embassy Jerusalem, UK, but also behind the headlines as well. As Christians, this is a time that we need to speak up. We can't afford to be quiet, we can't afford silence, but it's also time to show love and support to our Jewish people. If you know Jewish people, or even, for example, sending a letter to the Israeli ambassador or the Israeli embassy in Dublin, please do, because I think they feel the sense of hatred that is rising in the nations against God's people. And yet God uses these dire and dark situations to bring the true church back to him in fulfillment. But we also have to fight against church replacement theology, because it has blinded Christians to the truth of God's love and purposes for Israel and the Jewish people. And what God is doing in the world today is focused on that little nation in the heart of the Middle East. And we want to be a people that are blessed. We want our nations to be blessed. And we can only do that by standing with Israel. Shalom and God bless. Thank you.